Sometimes the hardest part of being a mother isn't going without. It's pretending your child doesn't notice. The soft beep of the checkout scanner echoed through the nearly empty grocery store as Emily Parker stood frozen beside the conveyor belt, her fingers tightening around the handle of the shopping cart. The fluorescent lights overhead cast pale shadows across her tired face, highlighting the dark circles beneath eyes that hadn't known a full night's sleep in years. Beside her, 3-year-old Sophie sat quietly in the child's seat, hugging a worn stuffed rabbit with one arm while swinging her tiny sneakers back and forth. The little girl hummed softly to herself, unaware of the knot forming in her mother's chest. Emily had carefully planned every dollar before leaving home that afternoon. She had compared prices, used digital coupons, and even skipped buying coffee for herself for the 3rd week in a row. Everything inside the cart had a purpose: bread, eggs, generic cereal, a bag of apples, children's cold medicine, and the one thing she had promised herself she would not leave without: Sophie's specialty milk. The pediatrician had recommended the lactose-free brand months ago after weeks of stomach problems and sleepless nights. It cost almost twice as much as regular milk, but seeing her daughter finally able to sleep without discomfort had made every sacrifice worth it. The cashier, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, offered Emily a gentle smile as she scanned the final item. "That'll be $84.26, sweetheart." Emily swallowed hard and reached for her debit card. She already knew the balance: $48 from her diner paycheck, $20 she had earned selling old clothes online, $15 her neighbor had paid her for watching a dog over the weekend. It should have been enough. It had to be enough. She inserted the card and held her breath. A second later, the machine beeped. Declined. Heat rushed into her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered quickly. "Can I try again?" The cashier nodded kindly. Emily checked her banking app with trembling fingers. Her heart sank. The automatic payment for her electricity bill had gone through earlier than expected. She was short by $14. $14. That was all that separated her from bringing food home for the week. Emily forced herself to smile. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'll just put something back." She looked over the groceries. Bread? No. Medicine? Sophie still had a cough. Apples? That was their only fresh fruit. Her eyes eventually settled on the half-gallon of specialty milk, the one thing she had promised herself she would never take away from her daughter. Her throat tightened. Slowly, she reached for the carton. Before she could place it beside the register, a tiny voice spoke behind her. "Mommy." Emily turned. Sophie looked up with wide blue eyes. "Did I do something wrong?" For a moment, Emily couldn't breathe. The question hit harder than any unpaid bill ever could. She immediately knelt beside the cart and brushed a strand of blonde hair away from Sophie's forehead. "No, sweetheart," she said gently, forcing warmth into her voice despite the tears threatening behind her eyes. "You didn't do anything wrong." Sophie tilted her head. "Then why are you giving my milk back?" Emily smiled, though it almost broke her heart. "Mommy just needs to figure some things out. That's all." Sophie nodded slowly, trusting her completely. Then she wrapped both little arms around her stuffed rabbit and whispered, "Okay, I love you anyway." Emily lowered her eyes before her daughter could see the tears finally escape. And standing quietly in line behind them, holding nothing but a bottle of sparkling water and his car keys, Daniel Whitmore suddenly forgot all about the business meeting waiting for him across town. Daniel Whitmore had spent 20 years building companies, negotiating billion-dollar contracts, and making decisions that affected thousands of employees. But somehow the sight of a little girl saying, "I love you anyway," had left him completely speechless. He remained still behind his shopping basket while Emily quickly wiped her cheeks and stood up again. She forced another apologetic smile toward the cashier. "I am sorry. Please remove the milk," she said quietly. The older woman hesitated. "Honey, are you sure? Maybe we can put back something else." Emily shook her head. "No, the rest is necessary." Her voice remained calm, but Daniel noticed the exhaustion hidden behind it. This was not a woman having a bad day. This was someone who had been carrying too much for far too long. A man farther back in line sighed dramatically and checked his watch. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Some of us have places to be." Emily immediately looked embarrassed. "I am sorry," she whispered again. Sophie looked toward the strangers around them with confusion. She did not understand why adults seemed upset. Daniel glanced at the expensive watch on his own wrist. 10 minutes ago, he would have cared about being late. Now, he could not remember what the meeting had even been about. The cashier reached for the milk carton, but before she could move it aside, Daniel stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said in a calm voice. Everyone turned toward him. His tailored navy coat, silver hair at his temples, and composed demeanor made him stand out immediately. Emily looked surprised. "Sir." Daniel placed his bottle of sparkling water on the conveyor belt and smiled gently towards Sophie first. "I think your bunny would be disappointed if she did not get her favorite milk." Sophie hugged the stuffed rabbit tighter. "Mr. Buttons likes chocolate milk," she corrected seriously. Daniel's eyes softened. "Then I definitely do not want to disappoint Mr. Buttons." Emily immediately shook her head. "No, please. That is very kind, but I cannot accept that." Daniel nodded respectfully. "I understand." He paused for a second. "Then allow me to pay for my groceries together with yours. It saves time for everyone." The impatient man behind them opened his mouth to complain again, but stopped when Daniel calmly reached into his wallet and handed over his black card. The cashier blinked. "Everything." Daniel simply nodded. Emily's face turned crimson. "No, I cannot let you do that." "Why not?" he asked gently. "Because I do not even know you." Daniel smiled slightly. "That is true." Then he looked at Sophie again. "But I know one thing. Hey, little girl should never have to wonder if she did something wrong because life became expensive." Emily froze. Those words hit a place inside her that she had been trying desperately to protect. Sophie looked up at her mother. "Mommy, he sounds nice." Emily almost laughed through her tears. "Sweetheart, we do not accept things from strangers." Daniel nodded again. "Your mother is right. That is a smart rule." He extended his hand politely. "Daniel Whitmore." Emily hesitated before shaking it. "Emily Parker." Their hands touched only briefly, but something in Daniel's expression changed the moment he heard her name. He could not explain why. There was simply something familiar about her kindness. Before Emily could say anything else, Sophie's tiny voice interrupted them. "Mommy." Emily immediately turned toward her daughter. Sophie's cheeks looked unusually flushed. "I feel sleepy," the little girl whispered softly. Emily immediately touched Sophie's forehead, and her heart sank. The little girl's skin felt warmer than it had that morning. Sophie had complained about being tired after preschool for the past 2 days, but Emily had assumed it was just the lingering cold that had been going around. Now, looking at her daughter's flushed cheeks and drooping eyelids, worry began to replace embarrassment. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" she asked softly. Sophie leaned against the shopping cart and nodded weakly. "I just want my blanket." The cashier looked concerned. "Honey, she does not look too good." Emily forced herself to stay calm. She probably just needs to get home and rest. But even as she said the words, she knew something felt wrong. Sophie was usually talkative. Usually she asked 100 questions and sang songs with Mr. Buttons. Now she simply rested her head against the side of the cart, unusually quiet. Daniel noticed the change immediately. "Does she have a fever?" he asked gently. Emily sighed. "She has been fighting a cold for a few days. I was hoping it would pass on its own." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Do you have a pediatrician?" "Yes, but they are closed already. I can take her to urgent care if she gets worse." The words sounded practical, but Daniel noticed how tired she looked. There was a difference between having a plan and having the resources to carry it out. The cashier finished bagging the groceries and handed the receipt to Daniel. Emily looked overwhelmed. "I still cannot thank you enough, Mr. Whitmore." "Daniel," he corrected kindly. "And you do not owe me anything." Emily lowered her eyes. "I will pay you back." Daniel smiled slightly. "Some things are not meant to be repaid." Before she could answer, Sophie suddenly coughed and wrapped her small arms around her mother's neck. Emily lifted her from the cart immediately. The little girl felt heavier than usual, not because of her weight, but because her energy seemed completely gone. "We should get home," Emily whispered. She adjusted the grocery bags with one hand while holding Sophie with the other. Daniel noticed the struggle immediately. There were 4 heavy bags, a tired child, and a woman trying desperately not to ask for help. "Where is your car?" he asked. Emily hesitated. "Actually, I do not have one anymore." She offered an embarrassed smile. "Transmission problems a few months ago. Repairs cost more than the car was worth." Daniel remained silent. "So how do you get around?" "Bus. Mostly. Or walking." She laughed softly. My daughter thinks city buses are adventures. Sophie managed a weak smile. I like the blue bus. Daniel felt something tighten inside his chest. He remembered expensive vacations, private flights, and meetings that could have been emails. Meanwhile, this little girl considered public transportation a special event. Emily shifted Sophie higher against her shoulder and reached for the grocery bags. Thank you again, Daniel. We will be fine. But as she turned toward the automatic doors, Sophie suddenly swayed in her arms. Emily stopped instantly. Sophie, the little girl's eyes remained half closed. Mommy, she whispered faintly. I feel funny. Daniel took one step forward without thinking. And for the first time in many years, fear replaced logic inside Daniel Whitmore's mind. Emily's entire body tensed as Sophie suddenly became limp against her shoulder. It lasted only a second, but to a mother who had spent 3 years protecting her child from every fever, every nightmare, and every disappointment, that second felt endless. Sophie, she whispered again, panic creeping into her voice. The little girl opened her eyes slowly. I am okay, Mommy, she mumbled, though her words sounded weak and sleepy. Daniel moved closer immediately. Let me carry the bags, he said calmly. Emily instinctively shook her head. No, I can manage. But even as she spoke, one of the grocery bags slipped from her hand. A few apples rolled across the floor. Without hesitation, Daniel bent down and gathered them while the cashier hurried over to help. The older woman touched Emily's arm gently. Honey, let him help. You look exhausted. Emily closed her eyes briefly. She hated this feeling. The feeling of needing help. The feeling of being seen at her worst. Since Sophie's father had walked away before her daughter was born, Emily had promised herself she would never depend on anyone again. Yet tonight, she could feel the cracks in that promise. Daniel handed her the recovered bag and spoke softly. Where do you live? Emily hesitated. About 20 minutes away. By bus. She nodded. Daniel looked at the rain beginning to hit the front windows of the store. The sky outside had turned dark much faster than expected. Then I am driving you home. Emily immediately stepped back. No, you have already done too much. Daniel remained patient. Emily, it is raining. Your daughter has a fever. You have 4 grocery bags and no car. I cannot ask you to do that. Good thing you are not asking. For the first time that evening, a tiny smile appeared on Sophie's tired face. Mommy, he talks funny. Daniel chuckled softly. Do I? Sophie nodded weakly. Like Grandpa Bill from church. Emily almost laughed despite herself. That is supposed to be a compliment. Then I will gladly accept it, Daniel replied. The cashier smiled warmly. Go, honey. Children get sick fast this time of year. Emily looked down at Sophie resting her head against her shoulder. The little girl's cheeks were noticeably red now. Her small body felt warmer than before. The mother's instincts she trusted more than anything else began screaming that something was wrong. Finally, she nodded. Okay, just home. I cannot impose any more than that. Daniel simply picked up the grocery bags. Deal. Outside, the cold November air hit them immediately. Rain tapped softly against the pavement while the parking lot lights reflected off the wet asphalt. Emily expected Daniel to lead them toward an expensive luxury car. Instead, he stopped beside a dark gray SUV that looked comfortable rather than flashy. This is yours, Emily asked quietly. Daniel smiled. I like practical things. He opened the rear door first. Miss Sophie, your carriage awaits. Sophie gave a sleepy giggle. Mr. Buttons, too? Especially Mr. Buttons. As Emily carefully buckled her daughter into the child's seat, she noticed something strange. There was already a folded blanket in the back, along with small travel tissues, bottled water, and children's coloring books tucked into a storage pocket. Daniel saw her expression. My sister has grandchildren, he explained. I drive them sometimes. Emily nodded slowly, but before she could say anything, Sophie's small voice came from the back seat. Mommy. Yes, sweetheart. My tummy hurts now too. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time all evening, Daniel saw genuine fear appear in her eyes. The rain intensified as Daniel started the engine, but inside the SUV, the atmosphere had become strangely quiet. Sophie sat wrapped in the soft blanket from the back seat, holding Mr. Buttons against her chest while resting her head against the window. Emily turned around every few seconds, unable to hide her concern. Does your tummy hurt a lot, sweetheart? Sophie nodded weakly. A little. Emily reached back and touched her daughter's forehead again. The heat made her stomach tighten. She feels warmer than before, she whispered mostly to herself. Daniel glanced at her without taking his eyes off the road. How high was her fever this morning? 99 degrees. Nothing alarming. Emily sighed heavily. But she barely touched breakfast, and she has been more tired than usual. Daniel nodded. Children change quickly. Emily stared out the windshield at the rain. I know. Her voice sounded fragile now. I just keep hoping every illness will be the normal kind. Daniel understood there was more behind those words. Has she been seriously sick before? Emily hesitated for a few seconds. Then she nodded. When she was 18 months old, she ended up in the hospital with dehydration after a stomach virus. It terrified me. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. Ever since then, every fever scares me more than it probably should. Daniel remained silent. He had learned years ago that sometimes people did not need solutions. They only needed someone willing to listen. Being a single parent means there is nobody to hand the fear to, Emily admitted quietly. You do not get to panic because someone has to stay calm. Daniel glanced toward her. And who takes care of you? Emily let out a small laugh that carried no humor. That would be nice, would it not? Neither of them spoke for a moment. Rain tapped against the roof while soft music played quietly through the speakers. Then a tiny voice interrupted the silence. Mommy. Emily immediately turned around. Yes, baby. Can we go home and watch penguins? Emily smiled softly. Sophie's favorite television show involved animated penguins that solved mysteries together. Of course we can. But Sophie shook her head slowly. I do not want cartoons. Emily blinked. No, I want real penguins. Daniel smiled slightly. That is a very specific request. Sophie looked at him seriously. Have you ever seen one? Only at the zoo. Sophie's eyes widened a little. Really? Really? Did they smell funny? Daniel laughed quietly. Terrible. Even Emily smiled. For a brief moment, the fear lifted. Then Sophie's smile disappeared again. She curled closer beneath the blanket and whispered, Mommy, I do not feel good. Emily's expression changed instantly. Daniel, can you pull over for a second? He immediately guided the SUV into a pharmacy parking lot. Emily climbed into the back seat and wrapped Sophie in her arms. The little girl rested her head against her mother's chest without her usual energy. Daniel watched quietly from the driver's seat. He had seen many things in his life. Success, loss, grief, loneliness. But something about the sight behind him made his chest tighten unexpectedly. Emily gently kissed Sophie's forehead and whispered, It is okay, sweetheart. Mommy is here. Then she looked up at Daniel. Her eyes were filled with fear now. I think we need to go to urgent care instead of home. Without hesitation, Daniel shifted the SUV back into drive. Tell me where? We are going now. The bright lights of Mercy Urgent Care reflected across the rain-covered windshield as Daniel pulled into the parking lot faster than he had driven in years. Emily was already unbuckling Sophie before the SUV had fully stopped. I have her, Daniel said gently. Before Emily could protest, he had already stepped out into the rain and opened the rear door. Sophie opened her sleepy eyes as Daniel carefully lifted her into his arms. Mr. Daniel, she murmured softly. Yes, Miss Sophie. Do penguins get fevers? Daniel smiled despite the worry in his chest. Sometimes they probably do. Sophie nodded weakly. Poor penguins. Emily almost laughed through her fear. Together they hurried inside the urgent care center. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. A television mounted in the corner played a weather report, while several tired parents sat beside children wrapped in blankets. Emily approached the front desk, while Daniel remained seated with Sophie resting comfortably against his shoulder. The young receptionist offered a professional smile. Insurance card? Emily froze for half a second. Daniel noticed immediately. Emily reached into her purse and produced a worn folder. I have insurance. High deductible. The receptionist typed for a moment. There will be a $150 copay today. Emily's face lost color. Daniel looked away deliberately, pretending not to notice. Pride mattered. He understood that much. Emily quietly opened her wallet. Daniel saw exactly three $20 bills and a few smaller bills folded carefully inside. Her breathing became shallow. Can I set up a payment plan? She asked softly. The receptionist gave an apologetic expression. Unfortunately, payment is required at check-in. Before Emily could say anything else, An older voice interrupted. Emily Parker? A gray-haired nurse stepped out from the hallway carrying a clipboard. Her expression changed immediately when she recognized Emily. Emily? Is that really you? Emily blinked in surprise. Mrs. Henderson? The woman smiled warmly. I have not seen you since St. Anne's Community Center. Emily's eyes widened. You volunteered there, and you practically live there helping everyone else. Mrs. Henderson looked towards Sophie with concern. This must be your little girl. Emily nodded quickly. Her name is Sophie. Mrs. Henderson's face softened. Bring her back right away. We had a cancellation. The receptionist looked confused. Margaret, we still need. Mrs. Henderson gently interrupted. I will handle the paperwork later. Emily looked stunned. You do not have to do that. The older nurse squeezed her hand. 10 years ago, when my husband was receiving chemotherapy, you spent every Saturday delivering meals to families you barely knew. You never accepted a penny. Do you remember telling me that kindness always comes back eventually? Emily looked embarrassed. I was 17. I barely remember saying that. Mrs. Henderson smiled. I never forgot. Daniel stood completely still. Something shifted inside him. All evening he had assumed he was helping a struggling mother. But now he was beginning to understand something much deeper. Emily Parker had been helping people long before life became difficult for her. She had simply never stopped being kind. As they followed Mrs. Henderson down the hallway, Daniel glanced at the framed photographs lining the walls. One picture caught his attention immediately. It showed a charity fundraiser from years earlier. And standing in the background beside a donation table was a much younger Emily. Next to her stood a smiling woman Daniel knew better than anyone in the world. His late wife, Claire Whitmore. Daniel stopped walking. For a moment, the sounds around him faded completely. Because somehow, impossibly, Emily Parker had known Claire. Daniel remained in front of the photograph long after Emily and Sophie disappeared down the hallway. The picture had clearly been taken over a decade earlier. Claire stood in the center wearing jeans and a simple blue sweater instead of the elegant dresses people remembered from charity galas. Her smile was bright and genuine. Beside her stood a teenage girl with long blonde hair tied in a ponytail, wearing an oversized volunteer shirt and holding a tray of donated food containers. Emily, younger, happier. Daniel slowly reached out and touched the frame. For years after Claire's passing, he had avoided photographs. They hurt too much. Yet seeing her unexpected smile again felt less painful than he remembered. It felt almost peaceful. Beautiful woman, was she not? Mrs. Henderson's voice interrupted him softly. Daniel turned around. The older nurse smiled kindly. Your wife used to visit the center every month. Daniel looked surprised. You recognize her? Of course I do. Mrs. Henderson chuckled. Claire Whitmore never wanted publicity. Most wealthy donors sent checks. She showed up with casseroles. Daniel felt his throat tighten. That sounded exactly like Claire. And Emily knew her? Mrs. Henderson nodded. Very well. Daniel looked back at the picture. Emily never mentioned that. Because she probably does not know who you are. Daniel blinked. What do you mean? Mrs. Henderson lowered her voice. Claire never talked about money at the center. Most volunteers had no idea she was married to one of the wealthiest businessmen in the state. Daniel smiled sadly. That sounds like Claire. Mrs. Henderson folded her arms. Those two became close for a while. Claire adored Emily. Daniel stared at her. A 17-year-old volunteer? The nurse nodded. Emily was one of those rare people who made everyone around her feel important. When Claire was going through difficult treatments, Emily often stayed after hours to organize meals for patients and families. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. Treatments. Mrs. Henderson's expression changed. You did not know? Daniel felt confused. Know what? Claire volunteered here during her cancer treatments. Daniel stood completely still. Cancer. Mrs. Henderson's smile faded. Oh, dear. She looked genuinely concerned. I assumed you knew. Daniel slowly shook his head. Claire told me she was helping at community centers while I traveled for work. I knew she was tired, but she always said everything was under control. His voice became quieter. She never told me she was sick until it was advanced. Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with sympathy. That sounds like Claire. She protected everyone. Daniel swallowed hard. Even after all these years, new pieces of his wife's life continued to appear like forgotten letters. Emily helped her? He asked quietly. Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly. More than you know. Before she could say anything else, a doctor stepped out of the examination room. Mrs. Parker? Emily appeared immediately, still carrying Mr. Buttons under one arm, while Sophie rested against her shoulder. The fear in Emily's eyes was obvious. Is she okay? The doctor smiled reassuringly. It appears to be a severe stomach virus combined with dehydration. We caught it early. She should recover nicely. Emily closed her eyes in relief. Tears immediately rolled down her cheeks. Sophie looked up sleepily. Mommy, why are you crying? Emily laughed softly through her tears. Because I am happy, baby. The little girl smiled weakly. Good. I do not like sad mommy. Daniel watched the scene quietly. Then the doctor looked toward him and asked a question that made everyone freeze. Sir, are you Sophie's father? For a brief second, the entire hallway became silent. Emily blinked in surprise while Daniel looked equally caught off guard. The doctor immediately noticed their expressions and offered an apologetic smile. I am sorry. I only asked because you came in together. Emily quickly shook her head. No, he is not. Then she added softly, he helped us tonight. The doctor nodded kindly. Well, whoever he is, your daughter is lucky someone brought her in quickly. After giving Emily instructions about hydration, medication, and warning signs to monitor overnight, the doctor disappeared back into the examination area. Sophie was already half asleep again, her tiny hand wrapped around Mr. Buttons. Daniel stepped closer. She is going to be okay. Emily nodded, but tears still lingered in her eyes. Thank you. For what? For everything. She laughed quietly. Honestly, I stopped counting about an hour ago. Daniel smiled. Then we are both safe. I have never liked keeping score. Mrs. Henderson returned with discharge papers and a small smile. All set. Then she looked toward Daniel. Mr. Whitmore, may I speak with you for a moment? Emily glanced at him curiously. You know each other? Daniel answered honestly. Apparently, everyone knows more about tonight than I do. Mrs. Henderson chuckled and led him toward the nurse's station. Once they were alone, she opened an old file cabinet and carefully removed a faded envelope. I kept this because Claire asked me to. Daniel frowned slightly. Claire? Mrs. Henderson nodded. She told me that if anything ever happened to her, I should give this to Emily one day. Daniel stared at the envelope in disbelief. Written across the front in Claire's familiar handwriting were 3 simple words. For Emily Parker. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Why did she never receive it? Mrs. Henderson sighed sadly. Emily left for college shortly afterward. We lost contact. Then Claire became sicker. Time simply slipped away. Daniel carefully touched the envelope. Even after all these years, seeing Claire's handwriting felt like hearing her voice again. What is inside? I never opened it. Mrs. Henderson smiled gently. Claire trusted me with many things. Breaking promises was never one of them. Daniel looked back toward the waiting area where Emily sat beside Sophie. The exhausted young mother was gently rubbing her daughter's hair while humming softly. There was no bitterness in her face. No complaints. Just love. Mrs. Henderson folded her arms. Claire used to say Emily reminded her that goodness still existed. Daniel swallowed hard. Claire said that. Many times. Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly. She adored that girl. Daniel looked down at the envelope again. For the first time in years, he felt as though his late wife had somehow reached across time and placed something directly into his hands. When he returned to the waiting area, Emily stood up. Immediately. Everything okay? Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Then he held up the envelope carefully. Emily, I think someone left something for you many years ago. Emily frowned in confusion. For me? Daniel handed her the faded envelope. The moment she saw the handwriting, her eyes widened. Her hand flew to her mouth. No, she whispered. That cannot be. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Because after more than 10 years, she recognized the handwriting instantly. It belonged to Claire Whitmore. Emily sat down slowly with the envelope trembling in her hands. Sophie slept peacefully beside her, wrapped in the blanket Daniel had brought from his SUV, while the sounds of the urgent care center faded into the background. For a moment, Emily simply stared at Claire's handwriting. 10 years disappeared in an instant. Memories flooded back. Long afternoons at St. Anne's Community Center. Shared sandwiches in the tiny break room. Claire teaching her how to arrange flowers for fundraising dinners. The older woman who had treated a lonely 17-year-old girl like family when she needed it most. With tears already falling down her cheeks, Emily carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a photograph. The picture showed Claire and Emily laughing together while decorating Christmas boxes for families in need. Emily smiled through her tears. Then she unfolded the letter. My dear Emily, if you are reading this, then life probably carried us farther apart than I ever wanted. I hope you never forget how proud I am of you. You once told me that people do not need grand gestures. They only need someone who sees them. I have never forgotten those words. You saw me during one of the hardest seasons of my life, even when I tried very hard to hide my pain. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for reminding me to laugh. Thank you for showing me that kindness is never measured by money. Promise me one thing. No matter what life takes from you, do not let it take your heart. The world needs people like you more than ever. Love always, Claire. Emily covered her mouth and quietly cried. Daniel stood beside her, unable to speak. For the first time since Claire's passing, he felt as though his wife had somehow brought two broken paths together for a reason neither of them understood yet. 6 months later, spring sunlight filled the gardens outside Whitmore Foundation. Children's laughter echoed across the courtyard while volunteers prepared for the annual family picnic. Emily adjusted a basket of donated books and smiled at the dozens of families arriving for the event. After months of encouragement from Daniel, she had accepted a position coordinating community outreach programs, continuing the same kind of work she had once loved as a teenager. It did not feel like charity. It felt like coming home. Nearby, Sophie chased Bubbles across the grass with Mr. Buttons tucked under one arm. Her stomach virus had long passed, and her laughter had returned in full force. Mr. Daniel, she shouted happily. Daniel looked up from the picnic tables and smiled as the little girl ran toward him. Miss Sophie, have you solved the mystery of the missing Bubbles? Sophie nodded proudly. They escaped to Canada. Daniel laughed. Of course they did. Emily watched them together with quiet gratitude. Not because Daniel had rescued her, but because he had simply stayed. In a world where so many people walked away, he had stayed. As the afternoon sun warmed the garden, Emily looked at the photograph of Claire she kept inside her purse. The same photograph that had arrived in that forgotten envelope. Softly, she whispered, "You were right." Because kindness had found its way home after all. And sometimes, the greatest miracles do not arrive with noise or grand promises. Sometimes they arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary people who choose to care.